committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning and welcome to First Coast Connect. I'm Ann Schindler. Poisoned, imprisoned, he nonetheless won the Pulitzer Prize for his newspaper columns while writing behind bars. We meet the remarkable Russian dissident, Vladimir Kara-Murza, ahead of his Jacksonville appearance tonight. Then, Jacksonville University scholars examine the historical roots of President Trump's unprecedented political power. Join the conversation. Give us a call on air at 904-549-2937 or head to firstcoastconnect.org where you can find all the ways you can connect with us and also sign up for our new daily newsletter, which delivers program information and a sneak peek at upcoming guests to your inbox every weekday. Stick around. We'll be back right after the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. The House is supposed to start voting as early as today on spending legislation. It could bring a partial federal government shutdown to an end. But House Democrats have balked. They want changes to the Department of Homeland Security after federal agents shot and killed 2 Minneapolis protesters. Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries.
ICE and the Department of Homeland Security need to dramatically change. And absent that, then a full-year appropriations bill is in deep trouble.
The Senate changed the spending legislation last week. It keeps 5 funding bills in place, but it only pays for Homeland Security through February 13th. House Speaker Mike Johnson.
The DHS bill will be debated, decided over the next 2 weeks, so we'll have to see.
The shutdown means some federal employees are furloughed again. A federal judge is temporarily blocking a Trump administration policy barring members of Congress from making unannounced visits to ICE detention facilities. Minnesota Democratic Congresswoman Kelly Morrison had been one of the people who sued the administration. From Minnesota Public Radio, Kelly Morrison reports.
Representative Morrison was granted access over the weekend to enter the Whipple Federal Building in Minneapolis, where immigrants, U.S. citizens, refugees, and protesters are being held. She says it was a horrifying and heartbreaking experience, and it felt very chaotic. Morrison says there are no beds, no blankets, and not enough food. The temperature inside is very cold, and she saw people in leg shackles. The Department of Homeland Security did not immediately respond to questions about conditions inside the facility. The Trump administration has criticized oversight visits, saying they disrupt normal operations and calling them publicity stunts. For NPR News, I'm Erica Zurich in Minneapolis.
Palestinians have been able to cross directly into Egypt and return to Gaza for the first time in more than a year. The partial opening of the Rafah crossing into Egypt comes as the U.S. presses Israel to move ahead with the next phase of the ceasefire. NPR's Aya Batrawi has more.
Gaza's health ministry says 21 people needing medical treatment abroad and their caregivers were able to leave the territory through the Rafah crossing since that border opened with Egypt Monday. The border has been mostly closed since May 2024 when Israeli forces invaded southern Gaza and occupied it. Only a few people were able to leave through Rafah during a brief ceasefire early last year. Meanwhile, 12 other people who'd sought treatment in Egypt during the war were able to return to Gaza through Rafah on Monday. More exits and returns are expected daily now. Israel's prime minister says far more people will be leaving Gaza through the Rafah crossing than will be allowed to return. His government has encouraged voluntary migration. Palestinians say it's aimed at displacing the population. Aya Batrawi, NPR News, Dubai.
On Wall Street and pre-market trading, Dow futures are lower. This is NPR.
Good morning. You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. I'm Stephen Ponson. Atlantic Beach residents are complaining that city administrators aren't doing enough to protect large legacy trees slated for removal by development projects. WJCT News 89.9's Michelle Coram reports.
Atlantic Beach, for its part, feels under administrative constraints. They posted a summary about the removal of a centuries-old live oak on First Street, a property that backs up to Tide Views Preserve. They argued that with the tree in the middle of the site, development was not feasible, and because the application had met all criteria, the city had no legal alternative but to approve the permit, and the tree was cut down around January 20th. Speaking at a city commission meeting January 26th, Mayor Curtis Ford called it a glaring issue.
This community really has an obligation at this stage of our evolution and this to maybe look at taking it to another level on truly old growth trees.
Ford encouraged city staff to look into options for stronger ordinances for certain types of trees like live oaks, magnolias, and cedars. Atlantic Beach native Kenny Richards has rallied in the past for old oaks threatened by development in the Sevilla neighborhood.
And they're amazing and incredible. They're unique to the city, but it's also just about generally a large part of the community just tired of seeing nonstop, unchecked development.
The Atlantic Beach City Commission's next regular meeting is February 16th. Michelle Coram, WJCT News 89.9.
Temperatures are in the upper 30s right now in Jacksonville.
Support for NPR comes from the Lemelson Foundation, dedicated to improving lives through invention, innovation, and climate action. And the William T. Grant Foundation, supporting research to improve the lives of young people at wtgrantfdn.org.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Welcome to First Coast Connect. I'm Ann Schindler. Today, a Russian dissident and journalist who survived 2 poisonings and 2 years in one of Putin's gulags. Former political prisoner Vladimir Kara-Murza joins us ahead of his local speech tonight at the Jacksonville Center for the Performing Arts. Later in the program, politics as usual or too far gone. 4 scholars examine the question as part of Jacksonville University's panel discussion. We preview it with political science professor Dr. Matthew Corrigan. But first, we're honored to welcome Russian politician, historian, documentary filmmaker, Pulitzer Prize winning writer, and former political prisoner Vladimir Kara-Murza. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me.
So it has been about 17 months now since you were released from prison. That's less time than you were actually imprisoned. Tell us, if you can, a little bit about your arrest and your trial.
Well, I was arrested about 6 weeks into the start of Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. He attacked Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022. That same week when he attacked Ukraine, his regime closed down what remained of independent media in Russia. There weren't that many outlets left by then anyway, because for all his years in power, Putin has pursued a relentless campaign to silence independent media in Russia. But even the few outlets that were still there were shut down within days of the invasion because he wanted to make sure that Russian citizens did not know the truth about what was going on. And that same week, again, Russia's so-called parliament rubber-stamped a series of laws making it a criminal offense to not only speak out against the war in Ukraine, but actually to even present facts about it, to even call it a war. And I think George Orwell could not have known how accurately his dystopian reality would be recreated in Vladimir Putin's Russia. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, literally speaking. And so they passed those laws. This was early March. And then they waited a few weeks because they wanted those people who disagreed with the war, who disagreed with the regime, to leave the country. Because, for any dictatorship, it's easier when their political opponents just leave. They don't have to deal with the arrests and the trials and negative publicity and so on. And a lot of people did leave. But for those of us who are political leaders in the opposition, I've always believed that the only way a politician can lead is by personal example. What moral right would I have to call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up against the Putin dictatorship if I didn't do it myself? You cannot do it from a safe distance. It's just not possible. And so they waited a few weeks, and then they started the arrests. And so I was arrested on April the 11th, 2022. I was coming back home after a meeting, driving back home, and there was an ambush. There was a special police regiment parked outside the entrance to my apartment building, and they took me into custody.
And you knew right away that was what was happening. Were you fearful for your life at that time? Because, I mean, we should say this arrest followed 2 attempts on your life that you believe were conducted by agents for the government.
Well, there was, in fact, an international media investigation led by the Bellingcat investigative outlet, and they've identified the specific officers of the Russian FSB, the Russian Federal Security Service, who work in this assassination squad, and whose job it is to physically eliminate political opponents of Vladimir Putin's regime. Look, we know, and we've known for a long time, what the price is for standing up against his government in Russia. Imprisonment is not the highest price. 2 principal leaders of the Russian democratic opposition, Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny, have been murdered at the orders of Vladimir Putin. I think it's very important that when people here in the United States, people in the free world in general, speak about Vladimir Putin, it's very important to remember that we're talking about somebody who's not just a dictator, who's not just an illegitimate usurper. He is all of those things. But we're speaking about somebody who is actually a murderer in the most direct and literal sense of this term.
And so you were taken into custody. You did have a trial. Can you describe for us what kind of proceeding that was?
Well, I'm a historian by my background and by my education. One of my areas of study was the Soviet dissident movement. That amazing group of people who had the courage and the moral strength to stand up against the communist regime back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And so when I was arrested, I was expecting my trial to be something like their trials were, back in the 1970s. But I have to say, I underestimated just how far back our country has traveled under Putin's regime, because my trial, if you can call it that, resembled much more the era of Joseph Stalin back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s than it did anything later than that. First of all, it was held completely behind closed doors. Nobody was allowed in. The very charges against me, high treason, simply for my public speeches opposing the government, this hasn't happened in our country since Stalin's time. And then, of course, my sentence, 25 years. This was the longest prison sentence for any political prisoner in our country since the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. Now, I have to say, since then, there have been even longer sentences, but mine was the first one. It was issued in 2023. And, on the day of the day my sentence was handed out by a Moscow City Court, I was escorted down into the basement cells, by a police convoy, handcuffed, hands behind my back. And as we were walking down, the commanding officer of the police convoy turned to me and asked, "So let me get this straight. Did you just get 25 years in prison for 5 public speeches?" I said, "Yeah, I suppose I did." He thought a little bit and then said, "Well, at least I hope they were good." And I said, "Well, that's probably not for me to judge." But this is the reality of Vladimir Putin's Russia today, where you get longer prison sentences for speaking the truth, for speaking against the government, than people often do for actual crimes like murder and burglary.
And you were held in a very difficult, a really harsh prison, one of the worst in Russia. You had terrible conditions there. I believe you lost over 50 pounds. Can you tell us a little bit about that you were in solitary and just sort of how you were held for long periods of time?
Well, there's a rule in international law. It's actually in the United Nations Standard Minimal Rule for the Treatment of Prisoners that says that prolonged solitary confinement is equal to torture. And I had known about this rule, for a long time, because before my own arrest, I often engaged in advocacy on behalf of political prisoners. I'd known about this rule, but I cannot say that I really understood it. I certainly understand it now.
And their definition is anything over 15 days.
Absolutely. So out of the 2.5 years I spent in prison, 1 year straight was in solitary confinement. And by the way, there's nothing new in this. This is the way those political prisoners whom the regime considers, quote unquote, particularly dangerous have been held in our country since Soviet times. If you read memoirs by Soviet-era dissidents like Natan Sharansky or Vladimir Bukovsky, you would see the exact same stories, always isolated, always alone, always in solitary confinement. And this is meant to isolate, of course, the political prisoners from the rest of the prison population. But it is, of course, also intended to torture. Because Aristotle once wrote that we human beings are social animals. We need interaction, contact with each other just as much as we need, water to drink or oxygen to breathe. And when you are so much as totally deprived of any human contact, well, you very quickly start to lose your sanity. I'll be frank about it. I was sitting in this tiny cell, 3 by 4 meters. That's about 10 by 13 feet. You have 4 walls. You have a small metal barred window under the ceiling. Your bunk gets attached to the wall at 5 o'clock in the morning with a wake-up call, and then you cannot take it down again until 9 o'clock at night with the lights out. And essentially all you can do all day is just, walk around in a small circle inside the cell, buried in your own thoughts and your own memories. There's nothing to do. There's nowhere to go. And worst of all, there's no one to speak to. And this is the torture aspect, because when we are deprived of any human contact, we start going crazy. You start arguing with walls, you start forgetting even the simplest words, you start forgetting names, you stop realizing the difference between what's real and what's imagined, and in these conditions, it takes a special effort to actually stay sane. The key here is you have to channel your mental energy into something practical, something constructive, right? So to occupy your mind. So what I was able to do, I was able to get a hold of a Spanish textbook. I was allowed 1 book with me when I was in a punishment cell, and 2 books when I was in a regular isolation cell. And I would just sit there. I didn't have pen and paper. They only allow you to write for 1.5 hours, and they take it away again. But you can have the book. And I was just sitting there from morning till night, just, learning, reading, memorizing, repeating to myself verb tenses, words, conjunctions, whatever, just to occupy your mind with something. And, of course, I never thought that I'd be able to ever use any of that Spanish. I did not believe I'd get out of that prison alive. But I thought, in the worst case scenario, if I did end up going crazy, I'd at least be able to shout at walls and at my prison guards in a perfect Castilian dialect.
A very gallows humor there, based on your time there. We should, remind people that you have 3 children, you have a wife, Evgenia. You were not allowed to speak with them or communicate with them during this time either.
No, that's another very Soviet-era practice when the regime seeks to punish not just the political opponent, but the family as well. The family has to suffer. And so, yes, I was not allowed to call my wife. I was not allowed to call my kids. And the whole time that I was in Siberia, in Omsk, I was only given 1 15-minute phone conversation. We have 3 kids. And so my wife had to stand there on the other side and, with a clock and physically take away a phone from one child after 5 minutes and give it to another, and then the same again. It's intended to be this way. The family has to suffer too. And I think, and I've always thought, and I think now, that it is actually much harder on the families of political prisoners than it is on the political prisoners themselves, because, at least, I'd never committed a crime in my life, but in the distorted Orwellian reality that is Vladimir Putin's Russia, at least I knew why I was in prison. Right? I'm an opposition politician. I'm fighting against this regime. At least I knew why they put me in prison. My family was only made to suffer because they have the same last name as me. And, we're speaking about all of these things that happened to me. These are over. These are in the past. But let's not forget that as we speak today, there are nearly 2,000 known political prisoners in Russia today. And they have families. And all these people have committed no crime. They've broken no law. They're only, quote unquote, guilty of having the conscience to distinguish right from wrong and the courage to say it out loud. And it is a shocking and sobering fact that today's Russia holds more political prisoners than the whole of the Soviet Union, which is 15 present-day countries put together, did in the mid-1980s, 4 decades ago. This is how bad, how catastrophic the situation with political repression in Putin's Russia is today.
You were part of an extraordinary prisoner exchange, the largest East-West prisoner exchange since the Cold War. You were one of 24 prisoners released, and you almost immediately began your activism again. Within days, if not weeks, conducting interviews, working on behalf of those other people who are still imprisoned and the people that remain under this administration in Russia. How have you been able to recover? How has your family been adjusting to this reality of yours now?
Well, it's still a transition. It's not over yet. For friends and colleagues of mine who have been in the same situation of imprisonment, in Venezuela, in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Iran, there are many dictatorships around the world. People tell me that it takes about 3 to 4 years to fully transition back into normality after you're released from prison. For me, it's only been 18 months, so we're still very much on that journey. But I just felt that when I was released in August 2024, I just felt that I didn't have any right to disappear and take some personal time when I knew that there were so many people who are still left back in Putin's gulag. 16 people were released, myself included, from the Russian side as part of that exchange. You mentioned 8 people from the other side, yes, so the total is 24. But nearly 2,000 are still back there. People who are not guilty of anything, who are only there because the Putin dictatorship is afraid of the truth. And for so many of these people, it is not only a question of unlawful and unjust and politically motivated imprisonment, it is actually a question of life or death, literally. I'll give you just one example. Alexei Gorinov was a municipal councilman in Moscow, and in the first days of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he came to his district council meeting, and he called for a minute of silence for Ukrainian children who are being killed by Russian bombs. He got 7 years in prison for that. As we're speaking here with you, he's sitting in a punishment cell in a penal colony in eastern Siberia. He's in his 60s. He's in very poor health. He was recently diagnosed with tuberculosis. We do not know how much time he has left. And so many others are in this same situation too. And so, in my view, it is imperative that the free world, that the governments of Western democracies continue these efforts to liberate and free political prisoners in Russia, because that exchange that was negotiated, that released me and others in August 2024, that was negotiated between 8 different countries, but primarily it was organized by the government of the United States and the government of Germany. And the most powerful statement that these Western democracies made in that exchange was to insist that it included not only their own citizens held hostage in Putin's prisons, because they were part of the exchange too, but also us, also Russian political prisoners. And it was a very powerful statement of recognition that the real criminals are those people who are sitting in the Kremlin and who are waging this war of aggression against Ukraine, not those of us, not those Russian citizens who are imprisoned because we had opposed it.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to former political prisoner and Pulitzer Prize winning columnist Vladimir Kara-Murza ahead of his speech here in Jacksonville as part of the Florida Forum Speaker Series. You can join the conversation on air by calling 904-549-2937, or you can go to firstcoastconnect.org to find all the ways to connect with us. We should say, one of the people released in that was the Wall Street Journal, Evan Gershkovich, who was imprisoned and got a lot of media attention. You were a journalist, as you are a journalist as well. And as I mentioned in the intro, you actually won a Pulitzer Prize for columns that you were producing for the Washington Post while you were behind bars. Prior to your release, you won this. First of all, how were you able to get those columns out and published? And did you have any awareness while you were incarcerated that you had been so honored?
So the one difference, if you read those books by Soviet dissidents I mentioned, and I reread many of them when I was in prison, it was just surreal to see how nothing really in the Russian Gulag has changed in this half a century. Everything, down to the smallest details that they describe in the 1970s is still the same today, with one exception. There is now a special prison correspondence system in Russia, where anybody from the outside world can go to a special website and write to a political prisoner. And then the letter has to go through prison censorship, and then if it passes, the guards bring it to the prisoner along with a sheet of paper for a response. And then I write the response. Again, it goes through prison censorship, and then it gets taken back to the person who sent the letter. This is a sort of one of the holdovers. This right to correspondence. This is, for example, something that colleagues in Belarus do not have. And I recently met with a former Belarusian political prisoner, and we were comparing experiences, and this was the one big difference. This right to correspondence exists in Russia, does not exist in Belarus. The reason being that during our brief period of democracy in the 1990s, Russia joined the Council of Europe, which is a pan-European organization dedicated to promoting human rights. And as part of Russia's membership, there were several conditions that had to be met. One of them was, probably the key, was the abolition of the death penalty, but there were many others too. And so these sort of slight improvements in prison conditions, that many of which Putin is now rolling back, but some holdovers are still there. The right to correspondence is one of them. This was how I was able to get my pieces out. And as for whether I had known about it, yes, I vividly remember the day. I believe this was in May of 2024. I was in this special regime colony in Omsk in Western Siberia, and my lawyer came on his weekly visit, and I was taken to this small room, locked up behind a glass, as you would see in the movies, speaking to the lawyer through the glass, and he told me that I won a Pulitzer Prize for my articles, and I have to say it sounded like something out of a different planet. This was totally surreal. There was just such a contrast between what he was saying and everything that was around me, and I could never have imagined that same October I would actually be receiving my Pulitzer Prize in person in New York at Columbia University. I mean, this was just, and I still have to pinch myself sometimes to ascertain that I'm actually sitting here in Jacksonville and speaking to you, and not still being locked up in that solitary confinement cell in Siberia. This exchange was a miracle. That's the only way I can describe it. But it was in so many ways a human-made miracle, because it was made possible by, so many good people in democratic nations who never stopped speaking out and advocating on behalf of all those locked up in Putin's Russia, simply for speaking the truth. And we must continue this advocacy. We must continue to speak out about all those who are still left behind.
There were 2 attempts on your life. We mentioned you were poisoned in both times. You had an extremely difficult recovery. In both cases, you had multiple organ failure. You were in a coma for weeks, and you have no reason to believe that the desire of this administration to take your life has changed, I would suppose. How do you absorb that? How do you live just day to day with the knowledge that your life could continue to be in danger? Do you feel unsafe in your daily life?
Well, the honest answer is I try not to think of this. I think it's not possible to function and to live if this is what you're going to think about every day. I mean, that's a sure road to paranoia, and I have too much work to do. I have no time for paranoia, so I just don't think about this. Look, again, we know what the price is for opposing the Putin dictatorship in Russia, but I also know that what I'm doing is right. I also know that my country would be better off as a normal, civilized democracy than it is today, living under this murderous, criminal, aggressive dictatorship. And because I know that what I'm doing is right, I'm going to continue doing it. It's just as simple as that.
So your work has continued in terms of advocacy. You are touring right now, as you have been, lecturing and trying to bring your experience, but also a message to people about what you hope that they engage their own politicians on about what's happening in Russia. What do you ask of people when you speak to them?
Well, first of all, and every time, I speak to a large audience, as I will be speaking again here tonight in Jacksonville, and somebody in the audience asks what they can do to help, if they're not elected politicians or journalists, or if they're citizens, what can they do to help? And I always say one and the same thing: please write to political prisoners. I mentioned this electronic correspondence system. There's a Russian human rights group called OVD Info, and they maintain an English language website when anybody from anywhere in the world can go on, write in their own language, and they'll get it translated into Russian, because obviously all the prison correspondence has to be in Russian to pass the prison censorship. And you can go on the list and you can choose any political prisoner on the list and write to him or her. And I always urge people to choose somebody who is not prominent, somebody whose name you've never heard of, because they're the ones in the worst conditions. Because, this may seem like a small thing to write a letter, but I can tell you, having been, in that solitary confinement in Siberia, I think only somebody who's been in that situation personally can appreciate how much warmth and how much hope and how much light there is in that sheet of paper that the prison guard hands you through the feeding slot in your cell door. That letter can mean a difference for somebody between surviving or not, between staying sane or not. And so it's just a few minutes out of a busy day, but I always ask people to please take time and write to political prisoners. This is hugely important.
I imagine in your touring around, particularly in this country, that you get a lot of questions about our current political situation in the United States. There have been obviously a lot of people who oppose this president's administration who make comparisons to authoritarian leaders elsewhere. He has also been very glowingly, he's praised your president quite a bit. And
he's not my president. He's a dictator who is usurping power in our country.
Okay. He has praised Vladimir Putin rather frequently. How do you address people who have questions about, path to authoritarian leadership, whether you think that this country is in fact on that path? You live here. What are your observations?
Well, many of the things that the current U.S. administration is doing seems to come out right out of the autocrat's playbook. Everything from pressuring the media to using the judicial system to go after opponents to ignoring the legislative branch. These are the things that have been done so many times around the world. And I think it's very important not to let this get to a point where it's too late to do anything. That's what happened in Russia under Putin. Because, the way Putin went about dismantling democracy in Russia, which we had before he came to power, I still remember what it was like in Russia to have competitive elections, independent media, political pluralism, and people could speak their mind and nothing would happen to them. Putin destroyed all that within a few years, but he did it very carefully, right? He didn't try to do it all at once. He did it gradually. He did it slowly, but he did it very consistently. And then came a moment when there was nothing left, to defend. I think it's very important not to get to that stage in this country or in any other country where that is a danger. Look, President Reagan once said that freedom is only one generation away from extinction. He was talking about any country. It's important to remember that no country is guaranteed a democracy automatically. Every democracy depends on active participation of its citizens. And I very much like, that phrase that Ben Franklin was supposed to have said to that lady after he came out of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And she asked him, what kind of a government did you give us, a republic or a monarchy? And he said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. I think it is very, very important to remember that every democracy depends on active participation of the citizens, and that every democracy can only survive for as long as its citizens act to keep it.
Vladimir Kara-Murza is speaking tonight as part of the Florida Forum Speaker Series. The event's hosted by the Women's Board benefiting Wolfson Children's Hospital. There's a link on our website. There are tickets available. It starts at 7 p.m. at the Jacksonville Center for the Performing Arts. Vladimir Kara-Murza, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for your work. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.
All right. Up next, Jacksonville University scholars examine the historical roots of President Trump's unprecedented political power. Welcome back. From dominating Congress to dispatching military deployments to American cities, President Trump has upended norms, constitutional law, and the bounds of traditional governance. But is his use of executive power and privilege truly unprecedented? It's a question my guest and three fellow scholars will examine at a presentation at Jacksonville University tomorrow night. We're joined now by Dr. Matthew Corrigan, professor of political science at Jacksonville University. Dr. Corrigan, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be with you, Ann.
All right. First of all, what gave you the idea of having this discussion in the first place?
Well, I get this question a lot from students, from citizens. How did we get here? And is this different? And should we be concerned? And so I thought it was important to bring the knowledge that we have at JU to bear. We've got some kind of unusual and unique assets, and so we wanted to provide that for the public. And we've got somebody from the law school, Associate Dean Courtney Barclay. We've got somebody from our Public Policy Institute, the director, Rick Mullaney. And we have an expert in presidential norms, Dr. Colin Schumach, who will join us. And so we're going to tackle it from a lot of different perspectives. We're not trying to change people's minds on the president. I don't think your mind will be changed. But we want to give people good historical perspective and the best academic research.
Why does it matter if this is out of line with historical precedent? What would that mean?
Well, I think we are a country of laws and a constitution, but in many ways we are a country of norms as well. At the end of the day, our government only works if people follow the law. And so if you get to a point where you have political leaders not obeying the Constitution or not obeying the law, then you got a real problem. And, your first guest obviously showed us the importance of minding a republic and minding our democracy. And so, again, it's just so many people have these questions. We thought it was important to try to answer them.
So we talk about a country of norms, and I think it's fair to say that one of the norms has been presidents who've occasionally stepped out of the bounds of what we think of as traditional presidential power. And
Sure.
it goes back to Abraham Lincoln and certainly continued through the Obama administration in various forms, whether it's asserting, authority to do interventions abroad or to reclaim rights that are constitutionally given for a period,
Right.
whether it's internment camps, but, perhaps more egregiously with bombing Cambodia secretly, under the Nixon administration. There's a lot of examples.
Sure.
So how do you historically take into account what previous presidents have done and then try to create some sort of benchmark when we know that they haven't always hewed to the Constitution?
Sure. I think you have to go back to the founding and go back to the debates on the Constitution. Remember, the whole idea of the Constitution really came from the idea that we didn't have an effective national government. We were under the Articles of Confederation, and we didn't have an executive. And so the whole debate on the Constitution kind of revolved around those questions. And, what came out of that was really interesting. If you look at, the first three articles, Article 1, the Congress, very detailed about what Congress should be doing. If you look at the Article 2 of the President, it's not very detailed. It talks about the vesting clause, executive powers vested into the President. But there's not a lot of detail beyond that. And there's a reason for that, because I think the founders were really torn between revolting against a king just less than a decade before. And then, but also realizing we need some executive leadership. So I think they really didn't come to a real answer on the question. So in a lot of ways, Article 2, they punted the question. And we're dealing with some of the after effects of that now.
For people who aren't maybe thinking in these terms, can you just sort of remind us what a co-equal branch of government does and is? I mean, how does that balance out when you have an executive and you have these other branches that are presumably providing checks and balances, but how are they supposed to be functioning?
Yeah, the basics, go back to, Congress is supposed to make the law. And so that gives it tremendous power. And I think most scholars would argue that when the Constitution was written, Congress was the preeminent institution in our system. The executive is supposed to execute the law. And, executing the law today is much different than executing the law in 1789 because, for example, being a commander-in-chief, well, that's very powerful. Well, in 1789, our army was 700 people. And our national government had about 3,000 employees. Today we have over 2 million. And so it's a much different scale. So the powers that were granted the president, I'm not sure the founders would really recognize our government today. And because it's such a big entity, the president's become much more powerful.
What particular actions under this nearly, just about 1 year old administration, excuse me, have are you focused on in terms of actions that were taken? Are there particular moments or particular decisions that you think highlight when people express concern about it, that highlight those concerns?
Sure. I think people have to sort this out a little bit. You can ask, what can the president do and what should the president do? And you may not always agree with what the president should do, but if he's exercising his constitutional powers, he got elected, and he's won twice. And just on looking from the other side for a second, I think Democrats have to ask themselves, why did this controversial person win 2 elections? And why weren't we able to beat them? Because I think that's an important question as well. But when you look at some of the things that he's attempted, the immigration policy, for example, that becomes very problematic in its execution. For example, President Obama actually has more deportations and removals during his first 2 years or first year than President Trump has in his second term. But the way he goes about doing it, most of those are at the border for President Obama. President Trump has, really gone into the interior of our country and started to remove people. And the way that that's being done, I think, gives people lots of pause, that you have, ICE and other groups running around with masks on and things like that. And I think people, really kind of question some of our morality in terms of not necessarily somebody's individual case, whether they belong in the country or not, but the way we're treating people in, some of these detainment areas. And it's not really in our tradition. And so I think that concerns people. His ability really to use the military in a much more, I think, aggressive way than we've done recently, outside of probably President George W. Bush. But again, in most of those circumstances, he's probably on much more solid constitutional grounds, because basically in terms of military authority, presidents can initiate military action. Congress is supposed to check military action. And the question is, will Congress do that in the future?
On the immigration issue,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's some constitutional pressures that he's placed, whether it's through executive orders that have kind of overridden congressional action or challenging constitutional laws like birthright citizenship. But there's also this matter that has come up really in stark relief since the beginning of this year, just about dishonesty when it comes to officials in this administration, particularly as it has to do with these 2 people that were killed in Minneapolis, and whether the actions of those officers who killed those people were whether they're, first of all, going to be held accountable, but second of all, whether the people that are their bosses essentially are telling the truth about what happened. And that seems like maybe a different, all administrations have been dishonest with people at some time. And we,
Sure.
Mentioned Nixon certainly is a strong example of that, but Bill Clinton, we weren't transparent in the Obama administration. I mean, this country wasn't transparent about the, drones that were,
Right.
Doing secret operations. So there's a kind of a rich history of dishonest leadership. Is this different?
Well, I think we can notice it a lot in a quicker fashion when it's on camera, and people are admitting things that will later be shown by somebody's cell phone camera not to be true. So I think that's problematic. So I think people have to take a deep breath before they start commenting in this administration, and I think that would be helpful. I don't think it's new that administrations spin and try to put their idea of events forward, but I think kind of the blatant way this administration does is different.
Historically speaking, what are the administrations that you think have really moved the needle in terms of executive power? And we hear this term imperial presidency that started in the 60s. A lot of people have invoke that these days. But are there certain moments in history that you think really changed that balance of power between the three branches of government and led to more executive power?
Sure. Andrew Jackson, it's our city's named after. He's probably the best historical example, and when you compare someone to President Trump. And he railed against the Supreme Court. He used executive power in a very forceful manner. He didn't abide by what Congress says or did.
Can you remind us just of some of the actions that he took that demonstrate what you're talking about?
Yeah, there was a Supreme Court case that dealt with the state of Georgia, and the state of Georgia wanted to take land that had been given to some Native Americans. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Native Americans, and Jackson just said, well, we're not going to enforce that. I'm sorry. And that's when you get into a real problem. And so people have asked, a little bit with President Obama and drones, but more often with President Trump, when is it going too far? When are we truly in a constitutional crisis? And I'd argue in two ways. That's when we know if we were in a constitutional crisis. One is if the president just rejects what the Supreme Court says, if the Supreme Court is limiting his powers, just outright rejects it. Lots of people will take a decision and try to, massage it a little bit and do the best they can with it. But if he outwardly rejects it, that's I think a real sign. The second sign would be interference in elections. And that's why I'm very concerned about what happened in Georgia last week, where the FBI raided, I believe it was Fulton County's elections office. The states are in charge of elections, and they should stay in charge of elections. I don't think our founders obviously could anticipate, our current situation, but because of technology and so forth, it's probably a good thing that we don't have one national centralized elections office. They're spread out throughout the state. So interference in elections would be a very severe blow. And with President Trump, you just never know because he's very hard to predict. And he's even joked about running again, and of course he can't run again. So again, I think those words have to be measured and watched. But the bottom line really is that President Trump is going to do what President Trump wants to do. It's our system was designed for other parts of the government and the people to check power. And so Congress really has not done this at all. You're seeing some signs of it in the Senate now. But Speaker Johnson has almost gone completely with President Trump, even with matters like spending of money. I mean, that is a core power of Congress, and you really don't think Congress wants to give that away. And the Supreme Court, we'll see. The lower federal courts have ruled lots of times against this administration. The Supreme Court has not, and we'll see. Some important cases are coming up involving tariffs, involving birthright citizenship, involving the Federal Reserve. We'll see what happens there.
Well, we talk about constitutional crisis. I sometimes hear that almost as if that's like the end in itself. But I mean, what happens in the event of a constitutional crisis? Like, what's next?
That's a great question. Because, again, at the end of the day, we've got to be a country of laws. And if the Supreme Court rules on something, you don't like it, people understand that, but you still have to follow the law. The president's the same way. If he gets a ruling from the Supreme Court he doesn't like, he still needs to follow it. If at the end of the day he refuses to do that, there's really no enforcement mechanism to make him do that. I mean, the Supreme Court doesn't have an army, right? So we abide by the law because we believe in the rule of law. And once that goes away, that's really dangerous turf. I don't anticipate the president doing that, but again, if we get to that point, that's when we've really got a problem.
Well, if you're just joining us, we're talking to Jacksonville University professor Matt Corrigan about a panel discussion tomorrow night at Jacksonville University. We've got to take a short break. We'll be back in just 2 minutes to continue our conversation.
Join WJCT Public Media and Rick Steves for an exciting virtual wine tasting event, February 26th at 8 p.m. Whether you're a seasoned connoisseur or just beginning your wine journey, you don't want to miss this enchanting evening with our very own world traveler, Rick Steves. He'll share his passion for travel and wine, guiding you through a hand-picked selection of exceptional wines from the most celebrated vineyards. Reserve your spot now. Information at wjct.org/events.
On the next Fresh Air, the succession story inside the Murdoch media empire, which includes Fox News and the Wall Street Journal. We talk with journalist Gabe Sherman. He's covered the Murdochs for nearly 2 decades and has a new book about the succession fight, the outcome, how it broke the family, and its impact on the world. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
How many people do you think know exactly where you are right now, or what you're wearing, or if you stopped for gas this morning? With AI, it might not matter if someone is watching because something already is.
We've already built that surveillance state. It's being deployed against people, but we're not really having the conversation about, is this something that we want as Americans?
That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
Thousands of people have signed up to document and protest the actions of immigration agents in Minnesota. They say they're legal observers exercising their constitutional rights. The government claims they're impeding the lawful work of a federal agency. Where is the line between observer and disruptor? And what are the limits to how federal agents can respond? Next time on 1A.
Today starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, I'm talking to political science professor Dr. Matthew Corrigan ahead of a panel discussion tomorrow night at Jacksonville University called President Trump and Executive Power, Too Far or Historical Artifact? So, Dr. Corrigan, you were alluding to some of the historical precedent, and other than Andrew Jackson, I want to ask you about 9/11 and sort of the changes that went into effect in terms of executive power after that. Can you just tell us how that changed things for the presidency in general?
Yeah, anytime there's a huge emergency, that usually means presidents are going to gain power. FDR obviously had to deal with the Depression and World War II. He gained huge power. Lincoln during the war, Civil War, gained a lot of power. So what 9/11 did, I think it did a couple things. One is it really made President Bush as commander-in-chief even more powerful because people were looking for protection. People were looking to make the country safe again. And so, a lot of that and power shifted toward the president, and even laws that passed in Congress probably wouldn't have passed in previous years without that circumstance. And so what that did is really put the executive not only as the military leader, but as the domestic protector. And once you start getting into domestic issues, that's a whole new I think, area for government power and executive power.
And you mentioned FDR at that wartime
Mhm.
leadership. You know, obviously 9/11 was a huge inflection point in terms of Americans' sense of security. How relevant is fear? How motivating is fear when it comes to executive authority? How beneficial is fear to somebody that is looking to accrue power in the presidency?
It's huge because, again, in our system, the president, either by default or by design, ends up being the leader during times of crises. If you've got a military situation developing and quickly developing, people say, well, Congress has the power to declare war. Yeah, but we don't have time to get Congress together if we need to respond to something very quickly. And so both the courts and Congress through time have really given the president the power to defend the country and even to initiate military action without congressional authorization. What the War Powers Act did in 1973 is say, listen, if you commit troops, you then have to go to Congress and get permission to keep those troops there. And so at the end of all of this, because of circumstance, because our country's become so large, and because it's become so powerful, the executive of the country has become powerful. And so the question becomes, how far do we go?
And is there a road back? I mean, when these powers are asserted by any administration, do we revert? Are there correctives that come into place?
Sure, there's a road back, and a lot of people ask me this question. The best road back is the midterm elections. And in other words, if a message is sent, and if Congress, at least one house of Congress, changes party, that sends a big message to the president. And obviously, he won't be able to accomplish as much as he would like to accomplish. And people said, I'm waiting on the courts, I'm waiting on Congress. It's really up to you in 2026. The president's people feel that they're gonna in many ways defy history and keep the House. Democrats are fired up about the midterm elections. If you feel that you need to do something, people who listen to this program probably already vote, but you need to get 5 of your friends to go out and vote, because that's what's going to send the ultimate message.
Does something like what happened in Fulton County give you concern about the reliability or the accuracy of the midterm elections?
Not as we stand now, but if that happens again and again, in other words, if the FBI or even, heaven forbid, the military comes to try to get ballots and inspect election offices, that's basically ending democracy. That's canceling democracy, and we can't do that. So I really think, with everything going on, this incident in Atlanta probably deserves more attention than it got.
Well, the event is tomorrow. It is at Jacksonville University's Gooding Auditorium. It'll feature my guest, Dr. Matthew Corrigan, also the director of the Haskell Institute of Public Policy, Rick Mullaney, Jacksonville University School of Law Associate Dean Courtney Barclay, and Colin Schumach, who's an assistant professor and lead research at the Public Policy Institute. There's a link on our website if you would like to attend. Dr. Corrigan, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
That's our program. Thank you for listening. If you missed anything, you can find all of our past and current shows at firstcoastconnect.org. And while you're there, you can sign up to get our new daily newsletter. First Coast Connect is produced by Stacey Bennett. Our associate producer is Isabella Casapow. Our director is Brady Corum, and our theme music is performed by Club de Belugas. Join us tomorrow when we talk longevity and why nature may outgun nurture. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. Highway, hospital, home, work. Where injuries happen can make a difference in the law and the outcome.
More at terrellhoganlaw.com.